Hello, and welcome to this week's program of the Rotary eClub of Silicon Valley. My name is Farheen, and I thank you all for joining us today. Each week, we connect with and hear from speakers who usually have a message focused on our love for innovation, entrepreneurship, and education. We have a very special presentation by one of our very own club members, Dr. Sarah Tuberty, OTR/L. Ever since Sarah submitted her application to the eClub, I have been so excited to hear this presentation. Sarah has the lived experience of a congenital hand difference, meaning she was born without fingers on her left hand. After earning a BS in biology from St. Mary's College of California, she became an AmeriCorps volunteer and then a flight attendant. In volunteering at the Shriners Hospital for Children, Philadelphia, and her work on the planning team with Camp Winning Hands in Livermore, California, Sarah discovered the profession of occupational therapy. Her life has been a journey of adaptation and understanding of the disability experience. She just earned her doctorate of occupational therapy from Boston University and her license to provide therapeutic services in the state of Pennsylvania. With that said, Sarah, please take it away.
Hello, great. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited and thank you for inviting me. So yes, that is sort of the beginning of my journey and I'm excited. So these are what my hands look like. I prefer the words congenital limb difference, meaning that I was born and that my hand looks like this. I had a few surgeries at the Shriners Hospital of Northern California, which is where I sort of grew up when I was a child. And there was a surgery that was sort of innovative in the 90s that took bones from my toes and moved them to my hand to see if maybe that would be something that would extend my fingers up a little bit. Maybe I'd have a little bit more function. So as a result of that, I also have small toes. And then I had an additional surgery where my thumb was sort of split away from my hand. When I was born initially, this was sort of one piece, and I wasn't able to sort of oppose my thumb. So this is a space where I can then pinch onto things, which is really helpful. So my life has been adapting in all of those things. So sort of looking at things in a social context. I was an incredibly outgoing little kid. I, at like 2 or 3 in development, having a hand that's different, it was something that I was aware of, and 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds are aware of it to some degree. Like they see their hands, they see that they're not the same, but it doesn't register, if that makes sense. It's not really anything that's a problem. And they make friends pretty easily if they're outgoing. And so I was very much in that space. I would make friends very easily. And then sort of in my own story, I changed schools when I was in 3rd grade. So I'm at 8. And at children at this point in development, at 8, sort of all typically developing children are really looking to the external messages they're receiving in order to figure out sort of who they are and how they fit into this world. So as kids are developing their self-concept, this is sort of what's happening in their developmental trajectory. So that's so kids in that space. And then when children have congenital differences, that's sort of where they're realizing that differences aren't the same. That's where things that are being pointed out to them, kids start asking what happened, why does your hand look like that? And then thinking that that's sort of a bad thing. So that's sort of a typical crisis moment that happens for kids around that age. And this is when children start coming into sort of specialty hospitals and really wanting to replace their hand. Like they want to have a surgery that will create a normal looking hand. They want to have a prosthetic hand that will look and function very similarly to a normal hand. Like they do not want the hand that they have typically. They want something that is normal, because we're trying to sort of realizing that we're normal and trying to fit in these social standards. So I was experiencing that crisis at 8, conjoined with being at a new school at 8. My new school didn't know who I was. I didn't grow up with them. So they were really afraid of me and had never really seen anybody like me, or it wasn't even sort of in their worlds that there was somebody that could exist with a hand like this. And the answer, what happened to your hand? I was like, oh, I was born like this. Isn't a very satisfying answer. People really want to hear that there's a type of accident or injury, and then, oh, I can avoid that accident, I can avoid that injury, and then therefore will not have this hand difference. So having that sort of double crisis is what I was experiencing. And I would go up to kids on the playground and ask to play with them, and they would say no, which was really jarring to me. So then in my own self, as I was developing my self-concept, I then believed that I wasn't worthy of being a human. My self-esteem plummeted, and I was very insecure. So then I started hiding my hand a lot, and then developed a lot of social anxiety because there's this moment of like, okay, someone would find out about my hand. But if I could just hide it, then I can just pretend that I don't have this thing that's different. I don't have to draw any attention to it. I don't have to answer these questions, and I can just sort of skate by. So I did very little to draw any type of attention to myself, because typically it could be really scary too. So sort of in that, it took 20 years for me to be able to be in a space where I am very like open and want to talk about my hand and sort of want to talk about this experience. And I found that through my occupational therapy program. I hadn't really gone into it knowing any type of disability studies, or really knowing any type of thing in that experience. So when I was then taking all these classes, so much of me was like, oh my God, we're talking about me. Like, I thought I was going to be in here to like be this occupational therapist. I knew how to adapt things, and I can sort of help other people adapt to things as they were, sort of engaging in different injuries or things that had changed. But then hearing so much of my own story in this was completely mind-blowing to me. And then I learned theory, and I was reading books that were talking, research was done sort of about me, about people like me, and that was just so validating that I knew that these things that I had felt wasn't just me, that I wasn't alone in this experience. And congenital limb differences particularly are common, but not common enough that I would have ever really interacted with somebody by happenstance within my own school system or my sports teams or in the grocery store sort of in my community. But 2 hours away was another kid who was the only kid growing up with a limb difference as well. So then reading all this research, it was really fascinating to see how much of my experience is part of the disability experience. And that if we when we think of disability is any type of physical or cognitive or sort of mental difference. They can be both visible and invisible, and then disability is sort of a spectrum. So I am on that very beginning spectrum of disability, if we want to consider that this being a physical disability, and that and I also sort of exist in that same space of being somebody who is also very able-bodied, right? So I sort of identify with both of these groups, to the point where it's really hard. Once I started finding my pride on disability, I got so much flack, because it's like, oh, well, you're not really disabled. And it's like, okay, let's stop those things, and how can we really figure out that I do sort of exist at these crossroads. And so much of what people, regardless of what their experiences were or what type of disability that they had where they were on that spectrum, the biggest thing that I was reading in my research was that not being seen as an equal person in society, and really getting a lot of those negative stigmas, that was the biggest part that people, regardless of the type of disability they had, was their biggest barrier. And that was my same barrier too. So in that, I was like, okay, all of us are part of this disability community. It's not sort of siloed with people who had, strokes, or people who had spinal cord injuries, or people who are power wheelchair users, or people have limb differences, that we are really in all of this together. And that was really sort of very liberating for me to be able to sort of understand my experience. And then I found research in that there's this theory on stigma. It's Stigma Theory by Goffman, who wrote it in the 60s. And he was talking about how people really, with these sort of different bodies, if we will, the larger society sort of sees them as non-normal and puts them in this different group, and then places a lot of social limitations on them, regardless of what that person is actually able to do is irrelevant, because society had already determined oh, you don't have two hands, so how could you ever ride a horse or do any of these things that people with two hands can do? You don't have the two hands, so it's not possible for you to do it that way. And then you could sort of place whatever type of disability, if you will, in that space. So then that person can either pretend to be normal, which is what I did. I hid my hand. And then they can sort of just take on that, okay, fine, I'm part of this socially limited group, and just sort of identify with the standards that is given to them. So, I don't have two hands, I could never be a flight attendant, or I don't have two hands, I could never be an aerial artist, because I don't see anybody with two, non-typically developing hands in those spaces. So how could I ever imagine that I could be there? Society says that I can't, so I won't. And then there's this really beautiful piece of that theory that that says that once the person sort of comes to this like self-awareness and realizes that there's nothing wrong with their bodies, that it's more that a society hasn't been educated on what the true abilities of that person is, then that individual can go back and sort of re-educate the society around them and say, hey, I know that my hands look a little bit different. This is sort of normal. This is part of the human experience, and that I can be a flight attendant, and let me show you how I can do it. And that it might look a little bit differently, and different's okay. I'm still able to do, the things that I need to and want to throughout my life. This is just how I'm going to do it. And maybe these are the supports that I need in order for me to be able to do it. Then the normal society, if we go back, that larger society is like, okay, cool. And it's generally pretty accepting. So it was just really fascinating to read that, and that I'd really felt all of those social limitations for such a long time in my story, that I was just like, wait, this is it? And then realizing like, wait, there's nothing wrong with me or my body, that this is just something that happens, and these things can happen, and I'm not the only one. There's actually quite a decent number of us. And that it's more that we have this sort of social society that has created what disability is. So we have prevented access for things just in how we built our world. And that if we're able to sort of create access for everybody, then it also, that access benefits all of us better, right? So doorknobs are really hard to turn, particularly I'm using that as an example. And a lot of our doors used to have doorknobs on them, right? And this is sort of a pre-ADA type world that we lived in. And then sort of once ADA guidelines came out and needing like push bars or needing handles, that's easier for all of us to be able to get through them, not just people with different hands. So that is sort of a lovely example in that space. So in that's a lot of the work that I'm doing, is trying to figure out how can we come back and sort of re-educate all of us to be able to see sort of that people with different bodies exist, and that we can rewrite what the narrative is on disability, and that disability is the largest minority group sort of within the United States. There's about 25% 25% of people who live in the United States who identify with having a disability. And there's this really lovely research study that came out that was analyzing films from 2007 to 2015. There was 800 films in this study, and only 2.4% of any speaking character was somebody that had a disability. So we're missing a pretty significant gap as far as representation in our media worlds. So in that, sort of in this like ambiguous, sort of space of disability theory there, that's sort of where I came to the aerial arts. I had started, and when I say aerial arts, I mean the like silks, the lyra, the trapeze, like those are the three that I work on the most. So it's anything that's sort of suspended from the ceiling that then you do a type of dance on. I found it when I was in graduate school, because I knew that once I started grad school again, that it was going to be very brain heavy. I needed something for my body to do, and I needed to take a class and go there for that class so I could just not think about what school was. And the aerial arts are really hard. So it was really challenging, and then challenging for me, particularly because it is such an upper body heavy activity, in that a lot of it is needing strength in my arms to be able to get up onto the apparatus, and then to be able to do sort of movements around it. And even in my first class I had taken, I didn't go up and say anything to my teacher. Sometimes I do. I typically do when I'm in a class, just being like, hey, these are what my hands look like, just so it doesn't scare you, or make anybody feel strange about it, I suppose. And I didn't have the opportunity to do that in this particular class. And even after that, she had sent an email to the department head, and then I had to have like a meeting with her beforehand. And it was sort of that conversation of like, we're not sure if you're going to be able to do this, which really sort of broke my heart in that space. But knowing that this is so much of what I have experienced my entire life, that of course someone would say something like this. And then just sort of really feeling that fire, that it's like, okay, well, how about we figure out ways where we can work on this together, so that I am able to do this. And I'm not going to be able to do this activity the way that everybody else is going to be able to do this activity. All of our bodies are different. We all engage in these things differently. And so I started I have done this is my 4th year in it, and things are different and things are hard and things can be frustrating, but still that there's so much within this skill set that I am able to do has been incredibly powerful. So that I did a performance my final year in graduate school. It was sort of a culmination, sort of celebrating me, celebrating school, celebrating the aerial arts that I had done as part of a spring showcase. And it was really beautiful because I was wanting people to look at me and wanting people to watch how my body was moving. And I wasn't using my voice. I was really just sort of using my body, and calling people to view that was really scary, but really powerful in that I'm done hiding, and I don't want to have to hide my hands anymore. I don't want to exist in that space of feeling shame for the way that my body looks, and really trying to call that people like us exist and people like us can be in these spaces, and this is what it looks like. So that kids or anybody else wanting to engage in the aerial arts doesn't necessarily have to have that conversation, that all of us can see, like, okay, this is something I've been exposed to. We may not know how exactly it'll work for this person, but we know that there's different types of adaptations that do exist, and let's figure out how to make this together. There are some research studies that sort of share, particularly in like outdoor activities as far as like hiking and kayaking and things, that it's really hard for people to have people with disabilities engage because they almost have these like risky bodies. And then engaging in these risky activities seems like we can't do that. But I just try to vocalize, like, instead, how can we figure out to have the appropriate supports and adaptations in place so that people can do it, and people with disabilities also have the right to engage in things that are hard and challenging. But we want to make sure that sort of happens in a supported setting, just as all of us would want to engage in any type of risky, activity in the most supported setting as possible. So I just really want to help rewrite that and change that narrative. So here I am, this sort of like understanding all of this theory and understanding my own experience, and not being afraid to hide my hand anymore. And I do have this, if I can share my screen, I have this image that I put together for a presentation. And it is just, these are things that people have said to me throughout my life. Can you guys see it? Yes? Yeah, okay. So this is an image of my hand. I have it in front of my face. So I'm holding the camera in front of my face. It's a picture of my hand. And then you can see the image of me in a mirror. I'm in my flight attendant outfit. But things like, these are things people have said to my face, right? So you can imagine the things that people are saying that I'm not hearing. But this like idea that it looks weird, that people don't want to hold my hand, that it's gross, that they don't want to play with me, that my hand isn't anything that anyone would want. And that like this deformed and sort of like abnormal and monster, and you can't do these things. Like, this is a lot of the narrative that I've heard my whole life, and I know that people like me are also hearing these things, and really trying to figure out that this isn't true. But like, none of this is real, and I don't need to believe them about myself. So and then I have my next image here. This is from my showcase that I just did in February, and it's a little excerpt from that. So I will play that too. Broken. Stigma entangling. Oh, sorry. Lost it. Let me come back. Okay. There we go. Okay. Broken. Stigma entangling me. Wraps my neck behind his back, high in the air. Great side up, wraps fabric around legs. Upside down. What happens if I let go? Yeah. Okay, so on a whole, that's a lot of the work that I'm doing. It's just to help rewrite what the disability narrative is.
Sarah, that was incredible. That was everything that I wanted it to be and more. So thank you so much for your presentation. And before we go into the question and answer period, I want to quickly introduce the other members on the call. So when I say your name, please wave. We have Rory in Houston, Sandy in the Bay, Kelly in Germany, Raquel in Mexico, Shags in the Bay, Rushton also in the Bay, and then Mahmoud. I believe you're also here in the Bay too. So thank you all so much for joining us. And so I would like to start with our question and answer period. Who would like to start? Rushton, please.
Awesome, Sarah. So I was thinking about kind of the nature of your research, right? And it feels like there's this potential tension between an effort to normalize a difference so that people are like, okay, it's a difference, and work to create prosthetics or other tech that's designed to account for a difference. And is that something that you encountered in your research or even covered in your research? I'd be curious.
That is a very real conversation I have of prosthetic devices, particularly for the upper limbs, because people tend to be that they use prosthetic devices can't replace a hand. So there's lots of different tools and devices that we do have, but there's a very high rate of non-use of them. So sometimes people will get them, they'll use them for a little bit, figure out that their body sort of does the things they need to faster, without having the prosthetic device. So one downside is that if I were to have a prosthetic hand, then that would cover my hand, and then I lose any of the sort of tactile and sensory feedback that I would want to be able to engage with an object. So I know that like if I'm carrying a cup, like this is how I'm going to carry a cup. And I can figure out sort of how much I press up on the candle to then be able to sort of counteract gravity to be able to hold on to it. So even if I walk around with it, I'm pretty good at balancing. So if I were then holding this in a prosthetic hand, I lose that feedback, so then I'm more likely to drop things. So but there are prosthetic devices that are being developed that are used as a tool, much like if you are trying to put a nail into the wall, like the best tool to fit that is a hammer. Like you're not going to use a screw to put a nail into the wall because it just doesn't work that way. So there are prosthetic devices that are used for particular activities, and within the research, those devices tend to continue to be used over specific time periods because they are used for that particular tool. But there is a big divide whether or not for children to even explore prosthetic devices, and some people really want them. Some parents, some kids themselves really want it to sort of recreate a hand. There are some prosthetic devices that are purely cosmetic. They are passive devices. They're not functional. They just are designed to replace a hand. And if people want them and that makes them feel good about themselves, then I'm in this perspective of why not? And then if it's not functional for them, they'll sort of, that's on their own journey. But there's a big kind of divide in that of whether or not that's something you want to do, or know that you don't have to have a prosthetic hand. You should be happy with the hand that you have. But I think it's sort of just exploring them. And if they're helpful, great. If they're not helpful, then we tried it.
Thank you. Rory, would you like to ask your question? There you go.
Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, I was wondering what % of the population has a disability of one sort or another?
There's about 25% of the population identifies with having a type of disability. So that could be a developmental disability, it could be a physical disability, it could be a like mental health disability, it could be chronic illness, any of those things sort of accounts for about 25% of the population. And this is the largest minority group. And it's also the only minority group that anyone can sort of be a part of at any point in their life. Anyone can acquire a disability. And fortunately, and there's the concept of that if we are fortunate to live long enough, that we will pick up a disability at some point along the way. So it is almost the destination as well. So to sort of really bring attention to how that this isn't just me as one person, it's sort of all of us. Like, how can we create a better world for all of us to live in throughout our life course?
Perfect. Shags, go ahead.
I actually grew up with a friend who had a special hand, and we just treated them as being unique.
Mhm.
didn't poke fun at them. We supported them. We helped them to do what they could do and helped them to do what they couldn't do. So I just found it to be normal.
Right, and that's so beautiful that it was a part of your normal, and to really listen and to hear everybody's story and to be able to support everyone in their different ways, right? Like we all need things. I need help grinding pepper. That's a really hard thing for me to do, and that it's that
Mhm.
that's okay. Like someone else can grind a pepper, or but then I'm able to help someone in another. We all have sort of these needs and talents. And that just because I have this hand that looks different doesn't need to be this like, whoa, I don't know if we can handle that way, or to be made fun of if I do grind pepper, I like use my face and sometimes it hurts. And yes, so yes.
Well, in that regard, they do make a one-handed pepper squeezer, pepper mill. It's a grinder that has a handle on it.
Yeah,
So I
good
recommend.
right, and I own one, but not everybody has one, right? That's not sort of the standard in every restaurant. But yes, and those one-handed tools are super exciting.
Awesome. So I actually have a quick question. So congratulations on your doctorate. That's very, very exciting. And I just want to know what's kind of the next step. What would you like to do?
That's a great question, because I think COVID kind of derailed a lot of our lives. What I really want to do next is continue on in this vein of research. I would love to continue, whether it's like going back for more school because I love it, or just sort of really deeply reading more of these types of themes and concepts on my own. I really see myself like writing and presenting and performing, and existing in these sort of conference spaces. I also am a co-host of a podcast called Disarming Disability, and that's sort of going over just disability themes and concepts. We have our season 2 drops on Wednesday, May 6th, which is really awesome. So we were working on developing workshops in that space to then be able to take to different, whatever types of universities. We had one set up and then COVID kind of derailed things. So we'll see what things look like when we all come out of COVID and sort of what that landscape is in. But I am an occupational therapist, and I also work as a flight attendant. So assuming what the landscape looks like once COVID, once life sort of comes back from COVID, will be sort of interesting what that would look like. But ideally, continuing all of this work.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. So seeing as there are no more questions or comments, Rotary members and guests, please make sure you fill out the attendance section and leave us a comment. Also, if you have an awesome idea for a program, please use the link below to submit your ideas. Thank you again, Sarah, and I will turn it back to you for your final words.
Great. My final words are that disability exists, that we all sort of have different needs, and that those needs are okay, and that the way that we navigate the world is the way that we navigate the world, and that we get to control the language that is spoken about us, in that I call this my limb difference, and it's not a deformity, and that's okay, and that I can be empowered to be able to call people to use the language that I would like to be spoken about me, just as we can all call people to sort of choose the words and the language that we want to be spoken about, so that we feel that we're equally represented in the communities around us, and do fun things.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and we'll see you all again next week. Bye-bye.